Hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of Project GaitWay. Today we have our volunteer, Howie. And as always, we're going to take a look at his video. He's included, hopefully, some moments of him standing still as possible from 4 different angles so we can get a sense of his resting posture. And then we'll see him walk, and I'm going to try, based on what I'm observing in his mechanics, I'm going to try to guess what kind of things might have happened to him in his injury history, because that's my idea of having a good time. Yes, my life is very interesting. So this is my first time seeing this. He's given us a little bit of information in terms of what are his complaints. He says he has some stiffness in his right leg. And right foot is also getting tender to walk on. I'm not sure which part of his right leg feels stiff or which part of his right foot is getting tender. So we'll just kind of have to see what we see. And as well, his left shoulder is a little quote unquote clunky in the scapula, and he's not really sure what's going on, but it doesn't cause any pain. So no major crazy pain problems, which is awesome to see. Just some stiffness, tenderness, and clunkiness. All right, so let's see. Oh, let's reverse that a little bit. All right, so he's standing for us. Let's get him in a place where it looks like he's kind of chill. Stop moving your shoulders. Oh, not quite long enough. Okay, this is me doing this real time, so it's gonna be a little bit fumbly on my part. All right, I think that's the best we're gonna get of him being as still as possible. All right, so what's the first thing that stands out? To me, the first thing that stands out is that it looks like his body, his torso, is rotated to the right. And perhaps this shoulder being a little bit lower than the other might be showing us there's a bit of a lateral flexion in his spine to the right. So if we were to draw that, it would look a little like this. This is his rib cage and his spine, a bit of a bend to the right and a rotation to the right. And it might not be a rotation to the right, but what's making me think it is if you look at this clavicle, it looks like it's a little bit further posterior than his left one, like it's behind his body more. His right hand also appears to be a bit more behind his body than his left hand. So it could just be the shoulder girdle and the arm that are more behind him, or it could be his rib cage and his spine that are rotated to the right, or it could be both of those things, or it could be neither. I always find it to be a little bit illusory looking at these things in a 2-dimensional screen. So we need more information to corroborate that. We also have the sense perhaps of his pelvis on the right being higher, a hike on the right. So a little bit of something like that going on. And quite a tilt in his head as well, a bit higher on the left. And it looks like if you get a sense of which direction his nose is pointing. Oh my gosh, that's too good. Sorry, Howie. That's supposed to be a clown nose. But his nose looks like it's pointing to the left, which gives us a bit of a left rotation in his head as well. Oh, sorry, so the right. I meant to the right. I'm so sorry. I meant to the right. Oh, right and left is hard. But there appears to be a right rotation through both his skull and his spine and rib cage. So that's kind of interesting. Observing this through the lens of how the body moves through gait, walking through the flow motion model as my map for that, we in gait would not want to see the skull and the rib cage both pointing in the same direction. We need a bit of opposition in those structures. So I wonder if there is something going on in his upper back and his neck. Which shoulder did he say was kind of clunky? The left one. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. Left shoulder. Sitting a bit more in front of the right one. Don't know why, but that could be positionally a part of that picture. Okay. Anything with his lower body that stands out? Well, to me, if we look at his knees, patellas, left patella looks like it's pointing right at us, 12 o'clock orientation, and the right patella looks like it's rotated out to the right, or maybe you could call that an external rotation in his right leg. So that is interesting. Along with the hike in his right side of his pelvis, and if there's a bit of an external rotation, potentially in his right leg, I'm curious if he senses a bit more weight in his right foot. This hike in the pelvis would give us a bit of an adduction in his right hip, meaning possibly more weight bearing on that leg. This external rotation out of his leg is a possible outcome if someone were to shift their weight into their right leg or rotate their pelvis to the right. It might create this whole leg twisting out to the side. So I am curious to see other angles of his body and, of course, in motion, because it looks like there's this rotation to the right, potentially pelvis rotation to the right, leg rotation to the right, and maybe even his entire body just shifted to the right. Curious. Okay, let's change to another angle. He's going to give us a side view, but I'd kind of like to see the back view first. So let's wait and see if he moves to the back view. Wait for him to settle. That looks good there. Okay. Interesting from the back view. And the reason it's interesting is if you look at the levels of his scapulae here, it's almost like the right one looks higher, but from the front view, it looked lower. So that is peculiar. But it does look like this right arm is sitting more behind him. Really interesting because also the border of this scapula, it protrudes more than on the left. Maybe it's just the lighting, not sure. Don't take any of this shit, completely conclusively. But if there's more of a protrusion in the scapula, that usually is associated with a protraction. But that is very interesting because let's rewind him back to the front view. And his right clavicle here, I don't know, it looks like it's sitting farther behind him. So there's clearly something that is very sneaky and deceptive about how he's holding his body. Maybe it just looks like this clavicle is further behind him, like a retracted position, because he's actually rotated to the right. Okay, so now let's go back to that back view and see that again. I'm aware that this is going to be a long ass video at this rate. I'm going back and forth all the time, but curious minds must know. Yeah, looks more protracted. It's really hard to tell if there's a rotation in his actual spine to the right. That would be giving us that, excuse me, hitting puberty again. Really hard to tell if there's actually a rotation to the right. That would be giving us the sense of the arm behind him. It's reminding me of a client that I'm working with now who has a rib cage and spine that are very clearly rotated to the right, but has a right shoulder that's protracted quite a bit, and it's causing her some right shoulder problems. So I'm happy to say that I'm very confused about this configuration here, and hopefully it'll become a little bit more clear when he starts moving, or maybe less clear as it usually goes. And it's really hard to tell with the shadows here, but it kind of looks like, I mean, if he's got this right hike in his pelvis, we're gonna expect to see a bit of a right lateral flexion in the lumbars, which for him, it's tough to say that it's there. His spine looks rather straight. Something funky happens in here. But then it looks like there's a little squiggle to the left in this part of his back. So that's quite interesting. Okay, so definitely some movement investigations I would want to do with his upper spine, well, whole spine, and his scaps and shoulders. Let's just not get too stuck into that. I have a sense that his pelvis is shifted to the right. Not a definitive sense, but nonetheless. Now, if you look at his feet, does one look like it could be classified as more pronated or supinated than the other? I'm not really sure. You could say that maybe on this left foot, his toes are pointing out to the side a little more. You can see more toes here than on the right foot. But I mean, if I had to pick a foot that looked more pronated or supinated, I'm not sure if I could. I'd be guessing. That's just my sense of it. I'm just not sure. So we're gonna leave that. Much more clear difference in his shoulders. So I would definitely dig into that first before making any assumptions about his feet. But it's interesting, he says he has this right leg that feels a bit more stiff. So I'm wondering if this level in the pelvis, the hike and the shift to the right, is putting his right hip in a state of adduction. So what that would do, in theory, would create a lot of length tension in the outer hip and maybe even down the whole leg, and give a little bit of shortness in the inner muscles of the leg, so the adductors and things. So I wonder if that's where his stiffness is most registered in his perception. Okay, let's see some side views. So let's reverse him a little bit and go to this right side view. Whoop. Hold up. All right, that'll do it. So side view, it looks like his camera is just looking at him from a little bit of a low vantage point, so it's tough to say. It's kind of illusory. It's nice if the camera can be like roughly at the same level as one's shoulders or hips or something. It looks a bit lower. Just looking at his feet. I'm just like interested in the color of his feet. Feet look kind of purplish. I'm not sure if that's the lighting. I think he said it was his right foot that was getting a bit sore. Before we say anything about that, let's just go to the other side view. It's hard to say anything without a comparison to the other side. All right. Yeah. Well, you can see his head still does look kind of turned towards his right. I don't really have too much to say about his side views, other than if you look at this lean back of his torso. And that's just a little thing that's interesting to me, makes me wonder about movement in his spine, movement in his hips. What are we going to see? The angle of his legs look a little bit of a tip forward. You could call that an anterior tilt of his entire legs, with what looks like a posterior tilt in the pelvis. Posterior tilt meaning the front of the pelvis is higher, like that, and then an anterior tilt in the legs, which would give us an extension in the hips. So I wonder if he has like quote unquote tight hip flexors or anything like that. This kind of position would give him some length in the muscles in the front of the hips, like the iliacus, quads. And there would be a little bit of shortness potentially in the hamstrings and the glutes there. So I wonder if it's the front or the back where he feels any stiffness in his legs. Okay, sip of coffee. It's enough speculation on his posture. Curious to see what this looks like when he starts moving. So let's get him into his runway walk. Here we go, Howie. See what we see. Well, that's a swagger. Let's see if he goes again. Yep, good. Well, you can definitely see some interesting things in his spine, hey? Does he go one more time? Watch his spine and just see, does he ever actually rotate his spine to the left? I don't think he does. It looks like he goes right, center, right, center, right, center. Interesting. Should we watch that again? Let's do it one more time, full speed. Oh, I forgot. I have to fast forward him through. I'm so sorry. So sorry. Okay, here we go. And that left arm never really gets behind him. Watch his left arm. It doesn't really swing back quite as much as the right one does. So those are consistent findings as with his static posture. So that's really interesting. Left shoulder is his clunky one, and his left arm doesn't seem to extend. Okay, super exciting. Let's break this down. So we're going to go through phase by phase now, and our model that we're working with to break it down is the flow motion model taught by Gary Ward, creator of Anatomy in Motion. All right, so let's get him into a right heel strike to begin. But it's an interesting journey from mid stance to heel strikes. Maybe we should start with this journey here. Just watch his upper body and how much he leans his entire torso into that heel strike. just a few times in a row, leans and twists to the right. Super interesting. Okay, but let's get his heel into just where it's starting to touch the ground. Right about there, we'll call it. Okay, cool. So as noted, it looks like there's quite a bit of a lateral flexion to the right and a rotation to the right. This scapula still looks quite protracted. And that's what we would see if an arm was swinging backwards. So that would be a glenohumeral extension. Arm swinging back would generate protraction in the scapula. So that's all good. We noticed when he was walking at fast pace that his this is his right arm. This is his left arm. His left arm didn't really swing back into extension. So that kind of adds up a little bit that we're seeing more protraction here. And maybe it is the fact that he's just rotating to the right, that it looked like in his postural photos that his right scapula was more retracted, just because it was in space sitting further back due to the rotation in his spine. Cool. If we go back to this moment where he swings his leg through, and it's interesting because it looks like his upper body moves more to the right than his pelvis actually shifts onto his right leg. His back foot is quite pronated looking. Maybe it's not, I'm not sure, but definitely doesn't look supinated. So I wonder if that will be the same shape his right foot gets into when it's behind him. Okay, before we say more, let's just move him along to another phase. So as his right foot goes onto the ground, we're going to get him into a pronated foot, which will be him fully weight bearing on his right leg in what we call our suspension phase. So it looks like right about there. And it's a lot more exaggerated. This, oh, that was bad. Let's exaggerate it. It's hike on the right in the pelvis and what looks like a lateral flexion to the right in his spine. And this right shoulder is still quite protracted. What about his right foot? Does it have a good quality pronation? Well, it looks like when he landed in heel strike, he's not really in an optimal contact on the posterior lateral calcaneus. So what that might indicate is when he pronates his foot, he's already partially pronated, so it's going to happen a little more quickly than we'd like for optimal shock absorption. And it kind of looks like his foot just kind of slaps down pretty quickly, doesn't really have much gushiness, if I can use a non-technical term to it. So I'm not really sure if that is a good quality pronation or not. Curious to see from the front view. But it still looks like most of the movement of his body is coming from his torso and arms, and scaps, and not very much in the hips. Let's see what happens when he goes into his transition phase or mid stance. It's right about there. What does that journey look like? So he starts to straighten up his torso a little bit. His shoulders look more or less level comparatively. There's this really interesting spot in the middle of his back. It's hard to see clearly. but I don't know what's happening there, but his muscle tone changes. Muscle tone is usually something that develops due to movement. At least that's my best understanding of it. And it looks like this area is that area where he's doing a lot of his moving his spine from. If you could get a sense of, you can see him in his lateral flexion in his spine. It looks like it might be in there, that's kind of like the point where he bends from. Down here, it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of motion. It stays relatively still, but in this spot, that looks like the kind of the point where everything is moving. So that's just kind of interesting. I wonder how he feels about this spot. Is it something in his awareness? But what's great is we got a level pelvis. Even his two arms look pretty similar. So not too shabby here. Let's get him along into looking at his left leg swinging through into a heel strike now. What does his body do? Well, interestingly, it looks like his body just stays standing on his right leg. See that again. It just looks like his pelvis is still on his right leg. However, it looks like a little nicer of a lateral contact point, so a bit better perhaps of a supination in the heel strike. I get a sense that his whole body has this lean to the left here, but it's not nearly as dramatic as the lateral flexion on the right side. So if you watch again that right side, his right leg swinging through, it's more clearly this, I said swagger in the beginning, this lateral flexion and rotation to the right. But comparatively on the left, it's more of like a lean. And just to backtrack for the nerds, if we have here this right lateral flexion, right rotation of the spine, we have a right plus a right in the frontal and the transverse plane. And in our AIM parlance, that would give us a spine that is type 2. I hope I'm saying that right, type 2. Which means the rotation and the lateral flexion are going in the same direction. And a type 2 spine is not what we want to see in heel strike. So this right heel strike strikes me, haha, pun kind of intended, as a little discombobulated. Okay. So looking a little bit tidier with the foot, pelvis maybe not getting as far to the left as we'd like. Whoops. And just make a note of his left arm. So note how far it is behind his body. And then we'll just quickly compare that to on his right side. I suspect this right arm is swinging behind him more. Note the protraction in the scapula. And on this side, get him into the left heel strike. Less arm swing, and the scapula doesn't seem to protract. So it's kind of interesting to think about him having a more sense of a clunky left shoulder. just typically in fitness and therapy, we think about, most people need to retract their scapulae because everyone's protracted. Well, what if a scapula couldn't protract? What might that create? I don't know if he's had an injury in this shoulder. I suspect something has happened that's keeping his spine in this type 1 to the right configuration. And I wonder if that's what's keeping more of his mass on his right leg and contributing to that stiffness in his hip and the soreness in his foot, just the amount of weight bearing through there. And is it being drawn there because of his upper body being in the configuration with the set of movement options that it has? Question marks. But we're not quite done. I'm going to make a wild and crazy guess about his right shoulder potentially dislocating. Maybe it was his left shoulder. I don't know. Any dislocations, Howie? So let's get him into his left foot pronating. And what are we going to see? It looks like it's kind of a rigid landing. Like not as much movement overall. Again, this interesting squiggly section in his spine there. I guess that would be somewhere around like, I don't know, T7, 8, 9-ish. This arm is still staying really hugged towards his body. Now there are two things that come to mind there. So we have an arm that's closer to his midline. That would be an adducted arm. I've seen in the past, if someone can't adduct a hip, in gait, it's all just this series of exchanges in the body to get us from one leg to the other. I've seen before that if someone can't adduct a leg, they will adduct an arm instead. So that could be one thing. Wild and crazy story, because the purpose of me doing this is I like to make up stories and then everyone can tell me I'm wrong about the story. Let's say, just for example, just for fun, because it's fun to speculate and make up thought processes. Let's say there was a dislocation on this right arm. Let's say that's putting him into this position where we backtrack. He's got this lateral flexion and rotation in his spine to the right. And let's say that now he's kind of stuck like that. That would hold this arm closer to his body, and this one would dangle away a little more. It might put more of his weight over his right leg just by virtue of his spine being stuck there. But then as he's walking, if he can't get his mass to the left here, for example, then he has to swing this arm a little closer to his body, an arm trying to do a job for a leg. I don't know. That's my crazy story at this point. I want to see from the front view what his feet are like in motion. And then that's interesting. So he does kind of lean a little bit here, but it's more of a straight line in his spine. So he's not really articulating his spine into a left lateral flexion. But he does tip it to the side because now he's getting his right shoulder higher. That's super interesting. So as he gets from his pronated foot position, suspension phase into transition, he really gets himself out of there using his upper body. Look at how much movement there is going on in his upper body. The left shoulder swings forward. I wonder if All that movement in that left shoulder is what's causing that clunkiness. There's a lot going on there. So this left shoulder area, missing extension, but has lots of flexion. Or I don't know about lots of flexion, but it's got more flexion. Okay, let's just get him into some front view. Whoops. All right. So let's go with this left heel strike. Maybe we can get him a bit closer so we can see more clearly. Okay, left heel strike. Wow. I'm really amazed at his toes. Those are like really extended toes. I don't know what that means. Okay, so there it looks like a heel strike. You can see very nicely from this view, this left arm being adducted. Or this one being abducted, however you want to think about it. Let's put him into pronation on his left foot. The toes get onto the ground. There's like a lot of activity in those toes, those extensors of his toes. Very interesting. I wonder if that'll look the same on his right foot. So he's in his mid stance. Oh wait, no, we didn't quite look at that. I don't think his bones in his foot, his midfoot, really move much. I think there's too much activity in these toe extensors. There's a ton of people on the internet saying that we need to strengthen our toe extension. Maybe that's true, but I don't think Howie needs that. I'd be curious if his toes actually can flex. Okay, cool. Let's go on to a swinging the right leg through into a heel strike. Less of a nice heel strike. It's hard to see his heel on his right foot, but that's just showing us that this ankle probably is not able to dorsiflex as easily. Yeah, maybe not as much dorsiflexion in that right ankle. That's maybe part of the sore foot situation. But look at just how much this arm is in front of him. And again, I'm not sure if that's his shoulder actually swinging that much or if it's just this big movement into rotation and lateral flexion in his spine and rib cage. Moving him along. Look at how much more chill these toes are. Wow. So toe extension, as we were seeing on this foot, is more what we'd see in a supination. The toes would be more extended. Toe flexion, toes moving into the ground, is more like what we'd see in a pronation. So there is an element of his right foot that we could say has more of a pronation to it, just based on the toe situation. This hike in the pelvis, if we wanted to make a statement about a whole body pronated shape, he's got more of a whole body pronated shape on the right leg, more of a pronation in the foot. Looks like more bend in the knee, more hike in the pelvis, even his spine, that type 2 spine, that's more of a pronation quality. And this is stuff you can learn about if you study Gary Ward's flow motion model, breaking down the phases, it becomes very clear that there are pronated and supinated body shapes, not just foot postures. So it's like we could say this whole right side of his body is doing more pronation, and the left side of his body might need some. Now, pronation as well as a whole body movement pattern occurs when the body is completely weight bearing on a leg. So it's just corroborating this idea that he's weight bearing a lot more into this right side with every step he takes. And could that be right hip soreness, right foot soreness? And then this left shoulder feeling clunky. Well, I wonder what it would be like if he got a little bit of extension in the arm, protraction in his scapulae, and then if he could find some spine rotation to the left and lateral flexion to the left. In particular, in that interesting section of his back, like right in here. So we want this shape of his body. We want that a little bit more to happen here on his left side. So what would make this left foot forwards pronated foot suspension phase possibly less accessible for him? Well, if we want to make some wild and crazy guesses, I already made one about possibility of dislocation or accident of the shoulder. AC joint injury. Wow, it's puberty day. Oh my God. To be honest, this is my first time actually making vocal noises today. I literally have not talked to anyone yet. It's kind of early. It's 9 o'clock in the morning. I've been up for a while, but it's kind of early, I guess. Anyway, so it could have been something that happened here or even here. You know, if someone is leaning away that much to the right, it makes me wonder if anything happened on his left leg. I don't know though. I'm really not sure. I would suspect, I want to guess more so something happened in the upper body than the left leg. But then again, those toes were pretty crazy on that left foot. So I don't know. Maybe something happened somewhere on his left foot. Not entirely sure. And then there's always the possibility of, I never want to rule out when there's that much of like a lean of the body into one side. Consistently, I've seen abdominal surgeries or things. I had one client who had this same kind of presentation. Turns out he had a bunch of cartilage from his rib cage removed and put into another part of his body to reconstruct it. And he was stuck in this rotation. Other times it's shown up as inguinal hernia, appendix removal, gallbladder removal. So I'm wondering if there's any like abdominal surgeries or even, I don't know, anything in this right hip that he might be, there's this osteopathic saying the body hugs the lesion. So it'll try to compress and, just give a nice cozy hug around a spot that's hurting. So it could be very well be something happening there. Before I go down too many rabbit holes, I'm going to leave it at that, and hopefully Howie can fill in some of my questions with his real answers and observations from his experience. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say about that. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks Howie for sending in this video. I really appreciate it. That was super interesting. Pop any comments you want into the video comments section on YouTube. I'd love to hear any observations from all 8 people who might be watching. I realize that these are long videos and not everyone is as much of a nerd as me. But for those 8 of you that are, thanks so much for watching. Stay tuned for another video on this same channel.